This is the third installment in our series of interviews with contributors to the 2025 book, Liberal Emancipation, Explorations in Political and Social Economy. In this interview, EFI Vice President of Scholarly Research Bill Glod talks with sociologist Fabio Rojas about his chapter, The Classical Liberal Response to Critical Race Theory, Material Gains, Expressivity, and Divisions of Power, and the legitimacy of liberal institutions in the face of racial injustices.
Today, I'm chatting with Dr. Fabio Rojas, who recently authored a chapter on classical liberal responses to critical race theory in the collected volume Liberal Emancipation, edited by Michaela Novak and published by Palgrave Macmillan. Fabio Rojas is the Virginia L. Roberts Professor of Sociology and Department Chair at Indiana University, Bloomington, where he specializes in organizational behavior, political sociology, and higher education. After earning his PhD from the University of Chicago in 2003, Dr. Rojas joined the faculty of Indiana University and currently serves as chair of the sociology department. From 2017 to 2022, he served as the co-editor of Contexts magazine, and he has contributed to major media outlets such as The Washington Post, USA Today, and The Hill. His books include From Black Power to Black Studies, How a Radical Social Movement Became an Academic Discipline, Grad School Rules, Everything You Need to Know About Academia from Admissions to Tenure, Party in the Street, the Anti-War Movement and the Democratic Party After 9/11, which was co-authored with Michael Heaney, Theory for the Working Sociologist, and finally, Sociology and Classical Liberalism in Dialogue, Freedom is Something We Do Together, which is co-edited with Charlotta Stern. Dr. Rojas, welcome.
Thank you very much, and it's a real pleasure to be here, Bill.
Great to have you. If there's one thing you would like, if there's one takeaway you hope a general reader can get from your chapter, what would it be?
Yeah, so the chapter is about two things. It is about critical race theory, and that's a school of thought that basically says that a lot of the institutions are inherently racist that we have in modern society. They are based on a history of slavery or sexism or exploitation. And for that reason, they're corrupt. They're just broken from the beginning. That's message number one. That's what they say. My response is that classical liberals should engage with that argument, and they have some good responses, which is just because the history of your country or your community has some bad parts, it doesn't mean that all the parts are bad or that there's a contamination from one bad part or one bad part of the institution to other things that work. And as somebody who's very classically liberal or libertarian, I strongly am an advocate of free markets, free speech, freedom of migration, and so forth. And these institutions are actually counterbalances. They are alternatives to these kind of more exploitative institutions that we've had in the past, such as slavery, apartheid, and colonialism, and these sorts of things. And that is what classical liberals should focus on. They should say, yes, there is a history of bad stuff. That doesn't apply to everything. That doesn't contaminate everything. Classical liberals have a lot of really good answers, and these answers are often institutions that actually help minorities.
So do critical race theorists necessarily see the world through a zero-sum lens of social conflicts? So that is, would they not view the modern world as essentially exploitative if they acknowledge the prevalence of positive sum interactions that, say, liberal institutions can make possible?
Yeah, so when they describe the world, they rarely use the language of positive growth. They rarely use the language of zero sum versus non-zero sum activities. And for listeners who don't know what this means, basically when social scientists and philosophers and critics look at an interaction that two people have, they say it's zero sum if every time one person is better, the other person is worse. Like you can't become better unless the other person is made really worse off. While the alternative are what they call positive sum interactions. What that means is that if Bill and I are trading, like, for example, I actually did hire Bill for some editorial work on the book he mentioned. So thank you for doing that. That's positive sum because I needed an editor to help me go through and fact check and, read the book that I was working on. And also Bill is, somebody who needs employment. So he gets the exchange that way. We're both better off. Like the world is better because I did this transaction with Bill. right? So the writer and the editor work together and they make each other better off. So when you read critical race theory, they almost never talk about that language. And rather, they seem to have like an implicit or unstated premise that either number one, it is zero sum, and there are some institutions that are clearly zero sum. So, for example, you say slavery, for example, is zero sum. That if somebody enslaves another, they get that person's output and labor and whatnot, and that person is made equally worse off, right? So, for every dollar I steal from you because I've enslaved you, that's $1 less that you get. So zero sum, it all adds up to zero. It's not productive. They tend to see the world in that kind of terms, even though they don't say it explicitly. Even if they don't believe in zero sum games, what they may say are things that, yeah, might be positive sum, it may be beneficial, but it's either morally suspect, is positive sum because it does something morally suspicious, or it is contaminated by a bad history. So, for example, they may say, like, look at Georgetown University. There was a scandal they had where they discovered that they had benefited from the sale of slaves in a colonial or early American period, right? So they say that contaminates the whole institution. So maybe positive sum, but that's like discounted because of this really bad history, or they refuse to acknowledge that the positive increase is really genuine or meaningful. So, for example, in a lot of these discussions, a lot of the people who discuss this stuff, if you say things like, hey, minorities in modern society have had declining poverty rates over the last 50 or 60 years, absolutely true in the US, is also true in other countries. They'll say things like, well, it's not that big of a deal. It's like, well, maybe it is. And that's part of the real debate, which is how meaningful are these changes? But I think your question is a really great one, which is you have to really ask some of the critical race theorists, like, do you really believe that modern society is literally a zero-sum game? Or do you really believe that the benefits are so small that it doesn't have any positive reflection on the system? And they're kind of evasive when you hit those points. They like to go back to the history and say that. Or the other thing that they'll do is they'll talk about inequality. So they may say, well, Bill traded with me. He's an editor. I'm a writer. We were exchanging, but maybe there's some inequality left over, and that's like inherently bad, and that discounts any positive growth you get from the interaction.
Right. Maybe following up a bit on this contamination point. So you contend that just because an institution may have some bad parts in the liberal history, that doesn't mean that maybe its more modern variant or version lacks merit. If I'm saying that correctly, you can correct me if there's a clearer way of putting that. But does this response mean that critical race theory defenders are really just criticizing liberal institutions for failing in practice to live up entirely to their ideals? And if so, how does that differ from an internal critique that maybe reform-minded liberals themselves could offer without falling into like the zero-sum mindset that you mentioned critical race theorists sometimes exhibit?
Yeah, that's a really, really excellent point. And when you think about different critical race theory writers, they do lie on a spectrum. So, and people who are really deep in this literature, they'll point out there's often a more pessimistic wing that says, this is so irredeemable, this is so horrible, the contamination is so thorough that you might as well get rid of it all and start over, or if they admit you can't get rid of it, they just get into kind of a pessimistic mode. So, for example, there is a genre of writing called Afro-pessimism or Black pessimism, which just says, look, Americans are so anti-Black, they enjoy dumping on Black people and harassing them and making their lives miserable. They just can't extricate themselves from that system, but yet we can't change the country. We can't get a different population. It's just baked into the history, and you just have to deal with it. And that's called the Afro-pessimist position for the obvious reason. And then there are other people who kind of get towards the reform zone where they say, okay, maybe we really don't think you should throw out the baby with the bathwater. Liberal institutions do have a lot of benefits to them, even though they might be contaminated. But really, I'm worried, and this is the critical race theorist saying, I'm worried about the hypocrisy. They claim to be emancipatory. They claim to be for equal rights. You read the Declaration of Independence. There's a very famous book, Notes on Virginia by Thomas Jefferson. As a classical liberal guy, you've probably heard of this or you've probably read it yourself. And so on the one hand, Thomas Jefferson talks about the rights of man, Then on the other hand, he talks about Black people being kind of like subhuman. And so that's a big strand of critical race theory, which is kind of an accusation, an unmasking. And often in like very left radical traditions of writing and social theory, there's this kind of expose aspect of the writing, which is these people say they're all mighty and great. But in fact, if you look, they're exploiting people, or they have this horrid history, or their riches are based on really shady and immoral activities. And then, if you just kind of lighten up a little bit, you actually get to the liberal reformer part, which I think classical liberals could really sympathize with and say, there are lots of cases where, one hand does something good and the other hand says something bad. And instead of throwing away both, you just get rid of the hand that's doing the bad stuff. Or you recognize that happened and you move on from that and you take the good stuff. So, for example, one example I like to use is, pharmaceuticals. Often pharmaceuticals were developed in an earlier period where ethical standards were not great. People were abused in the development of pharmaceuticals. We have better standards now. Some of those cases were racially tinged, like the Tuskegee experiment is always cited as an example of that. Other examples are, some of the pharmaceutical firms in Europe had a dodgy past in the early 20th century with authoritarian regimes, like, the Third Reich and whatnot. But still, you wouldn't then say because the guys who invented aspirin or who worked on penicillin were themselves racist or abused people in their laboratory, doesn't mean that we shouldn't save our lives using, aspirin or penicillin or other pharmaceuticals. There's a very reasonable way to say, and it's not crazy to say, that history is complicated. People do good and bad things. And just because a person does a bad thing doesn't mean it cancels out all good things that they may have done. And I think that's just something that a lot of critical race writers don't want to cede on some point. If you grab them in a seminar room, of course they would say, yeah, of course you could do that, because they themselves are not giving up the medicine that they find at the hospital, right? But in terms of their books and rhetoric, they often say it's like irredeemably, conjoined. I recently gave a lecture at the Populi Institute in Bolivia, where they had a classical liberal conference with some of our friends. And I was talking about some of these issues, and I quoted Ibram Kendi, the author of How to Be Anti-Racist. And he does not take a reformer's attitude. And I quoted a section of the book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, where he says, capitalism and racism are conjoined twins. Like, you just can't get rid of one without the other. And this is where, like, the liberal reformers and classical liberals will disagree. It's like, no, they're not conjoined twins. They're more like bad roommates. And it's very easy. You can evict a bad roommate. Let's get rid of that guy and keep the good one. And that's what you want to do.
Yeah, this kind of makes me think of some of the new history of capitalism literature, but it seems like one response to that is that, yeah, maybe slavery needed capitalism in some form in order to have the slave trade and things like that, but that doesn't mean that it doesn't follow that capitalism needed slavery in order to spread or proliferate. I wanted to maybe dive a little bit deeper into your chapter and some of the other critical race theory charges against liberalism. So there's four things that you sort of examine. Number one, that liberalism perpetrates vicious cycles. They're perpetuated by legally enforced racial segregation. Oh, yeah. Secondly, lack of race neutrality in practice. So you see like a drug policy that disproportionately targets minorities. Number three, so-called free speech that burdens minorities. And then fourth, property claims that are rooted in what you've talked about: slavery, racial discrimination, housing discrimination, redlining, things like that. But it seems to me that any liberal worth their salt would claim that at least items 1, 2, and 4 are really illiberal practices.
Yeah.
Whereas the harmful speech, quote, speech alleged in 3 isn't politically relevant unless it brings threats or harm that go beyond speech itself. So, discriminatory laws and arguably drug prohibitions are themselves illiberal. So maybe this is maybe we've gone over this a little bit already, but are critical race theory defenders strawmanning liberalism for features of imperfect society whose failures are not because of liberalism, but indeed departures from it?
Yeah, and so I think the answer is yes and no. Mm-hmm. And the reason, and it's kind of complicated. So one issue is that there is a tendency amongst that line of literature to label anything that they don't like as liberalism or as the bad guy, right? So, for example, you mentioned that there are things that are inherently illiberal, such as drug prohibition. And, for our audience who's probably listening to this, we're probably classical liberal in some version. And so we see drug legalization as a positive thing, as a liberal thing, because it enhances freedom and reduces the need of the state to interfere with your life. And so, this is a case where, the shoe doesn't fit, so you must quit, and so, it's a case where classical liberals do not advocate these policies. However, on the other hand, what you might call modern or progressive liberals have often pushed these policies. So, for example, both the Democrat and Republican parties are pretty strongly behind drug prohibition. Even today, they've lightened up a little bit on marijuana, but that's it. And so you could say, well, there's at least one version of liberalism that they really care about. Then in other cases, like your case number 3 about free speech, I think that is actually a little bit more interesting of a case where, when people abuse freedom, and that's when people, will use free speech to taunt minorities, to trash talk them, to denigrate them, to humiliate them, and that sort of thing. I think that's a little bit more true because one of the things about liberalism, and people have always noticed this about liberalism in any of its forms, is that it has to coexist on some level with illiberalism, right? Not illiberalism at the institutional level, but illiberalism at the individual level. And ideally, because I know you're a righteous do, Bill, you would not go out and spray paint nasty signs on synagogues and that sort of thing. You're a really wonderful person. But there are people who maintain nasty websites that say horrible things about religious groups or certain groups of people. And classical liberals would have to say, I don't approve of that, but they have the right to do it. And this is ammunition for critical race theorists. And also, I would say, maybe in a way they're correct, which is that's disproportionately going to fall on the shoulders of minorities. But then the question is, then what? What are you going to do then? And so and this brings up a bigger point, which is one of the themes that runs through both classical liberal and critical race theory writing is that the world is unfair and really horrible and people do bad things to each other, right? But then the question is, then what? Once we recognize that, then what are you going to do? The critical race theorists would say, this is so horrible, all the things that you guys propose should be gotten rid of, or really seen with skepticism at the very least. While the classical liberals would say, no, we actually have some good countermeasures or reasonable countermeasures. So, for example, in terms of regulating speech, there's one very simple starting point, which is you have free speech in your house, not in the public square, right? Or on a street corner. There are theories of like negative externalities. Like if you do something that bleeds over into somebody else, and for listeners who aren't familiar with the phrase negative externality, it's a term from economics that means if you do something bad and it spills over to your neighbor, like you have a barbecue and it smells really bad. Well, that's a bad example. Barbecue's amazing, but you're cooking something really bad and the smell goes over to somebody else's house. You're not allowed to do that. You have to cook your food in a way that respects your neighbors. So, we wouldn't ban illiberal people from saying nasty things about certain religious groups, but certainly there are lots of civil remedies for that. Also, the other thing is to, have a very strong, bright line between saying that you don't like X and then, as you noted, advocating violence or harm towards X. That's a very bright line. That's a very good line. And also, I would say for liberals of all stripes, not just classical liberals, but also a lot of modern liberals or kind of left liberals, is to take pride in the record of liberalism. That the other ways of regulating these things have a lot of bad side effects. And like one theme that we'll get into later, I'm sure, is this whole division of power thing. And I've thought of that. I thought of our conversation that was coming up because I saw a news report that said, Donald Trump wants to nationalize elections, and that's probably so he can control them and kind of shift them in the direction he wants them to go in. And the breaking up of political control at different units is a very classical liberal idea, right? That goes back to James Madison. And so liberals always contested that, saying, or like critical race people say, well, you're just pushing for local control or authority because you want to discriminate against certain groups in your town. That was the argument made against state rights in, say, the civil rights era. But now that we see a liberal actor trying to nationalize things, you're like, well, this is it. The system is buckling, but it's working as long as you guys buy into this idea of division of powers. So getting back to your original point, what I would say is that in a lot of cases, these are not problems with liberalism because they're not even liberal policies. Like in this literature, for example, we'll talk about redlining. That was actually required by, various federal agencies. And redlining, for people who don't know, was the practice of, in the midnight 20th century, where people would take a red pen and say people who are black cannot live in this neighborhood, and they would draw on a red pen. And that was not driven by the real estate industry, which is like, the market institution. It was driven by federal loan guarantors who wanted to enforce racial boundaries, because the normal thing is for people to mix, right? People to sell their house and new people come in. And there may be concentrations of white and black people, but there's no like strict boundaries, and neighborhoods get mixed up all the time. But if people say, well, that's a failure of the real estate market, it's like, no, that was a direct result of state intervention in that case. Like you said, drug prohibition is another case where they throw it at classical liberals. It's like, no, we are actually the opposite. We don't do that. And we are very sensitive to the fact that minorities often take the hit in years of prohibition, right? So so these are really good points. And then for cases where, like, there are liberal institutions or practices that may fall on minorities, we have to ask, okay, what's a reasonable response to that? Do we really want to get rid of free speech? Do you want speech codes and speech committees? That doesn't sound like the right thing that will help black people live a happier life in their neighborhood. Like, we got to do something else.
Right. I wanted to look a little more into, you mentioned the sort of the Madisonian division of powers that liberals and classical liberals often defend, and the importance of that we're seeing today of states and localities being able to assert their authority against federalizing of things like elections or immigration enforcement, things like that. But I kind of want to maybe push the other way and look at another potential, what I think, many people would argue is a threat to minority voices within a liberal democracy. And that's whether the Voting Rights Act is going to be overturned. And that's the situation where you have state actors, state authorities who currently do not have the right to gerrymander along racial grounds. And now the question is, well, there's this federal protection against states from doing that, but is the Voting Rights Act something that, for instance, you think should be protected to prevent states from doing this very racially based gerrymandering, or is there some other way to deal with this issue that doesn't threaten minority voices in the ways that I think many critics of the current situation might have?
Yeah, that's a really great example, and it's a super important example, to protect people's voting rights. And when I think about the Voting Rights Act, I always go back to the history. What was the specific situation in the early 1960s that required the federal government to set up the Voting Rights Act? And for people who don't know, when you think about the Voting Rights Act, you think that the only thing it contains is the right of individuals to vote regardless of their race. That's part of it. That's not the whole thing. Other parts of the Voting Rights Act have, as you mentioned, rules that give the federal government the power to regulate how elections are happening inside those states. And you may say, well, Fabio, given what you just said a minute ago about division of powers, isn't that a contradiction? Don't you want to return everything to the states? And what I would say is that, the right to do something is dependent on how you treat people. And the situation in the 1960s was that Southern states were doing a huge amount of work trying to disenfranchise Black voters. And that is why those rules and regulations were set up. So, so the division of powers is a tool towards a greater end. We would like to divide powers to counteract people's tribal tendencies. That's what James Madison said back in 18 or 17, whatever, when the Federalist Paper number 10 was written. But what was happening is that giving it to the states basically gave them like a small monopoly, where it was very difficult for people to even vote at all, or they were, or their rights were so curtailed by bizarre gerrymandering and whatnot that you needed some extra influence to break that up. And this is why, even though I'm very open to Madisonian arguments, and I think they're great actually, and I think like the Trump era is a great example of that. That this were France and Trump were the president of France, that he could implement way more of the stuff he wants to do, and with way less resistance. But in the U.S., because it's all broken up into all these different states and all these different levels of resistance, that there's some brakes being put on that transformation that Trump is trying to do. But still, even though I think the Madisonian division of powers is important, that's I don't believe in them because of their own beauty or their own intrinsic merit. I only believe in them because of the consequences they have. They're a tool that people can use to assert their rights, even illiberal groups, right? So, like, if there were like a small neighborhood, of people with really illiberal points of view, they could do that, and they're allowed to do that. And like, there are cases in this country, like I was reading online the other day about like this white nationalist commune in like Arkansas or something. It's like, I wouldn't want them to be the governor of the state, but if they want to have a plot of land and do their thing privately, who am I? I may not like that, but they certainly have the right to do it. And classical liberals, I think, would be on the right side of the argument to say they can do it. But the point is that I don't want a society where large majorities are constantly bullying minorities. Well, this wasn't covered in the chapter a lot, but there's some other writings that I've had which talk about this, which is that in public choice theory, which is one version or one branch of the liberal tradition, um, it was I think James Buchanan or Gordon Tullock who wrote and this is a very brief thing, and this is covered in the journal Public Choice, but in their writings like 50 years ago, when thinking about black-white relationships, they said that sometimes in a democracy, one group wants to bully the other to death. And no matter what set of rules you set up, they're going to break those rules and make your life miserable and try to make your life really bad. So in such a situation, you have to think about giving special rights or some extra consideration to groups in that situation. I think they call that a special problem. There's this kind of racial antagonism. So getting back to the case of the Voting Rights Act, I think that's a really great case where like they had a couple hundred years of history. They showed that they were going to tolerate slavery. Then they showed that they were going to oppose black rights, left and right during Reconstruction, and they showed that they were willing to segregate them and set up a regime of violence. Where this is the age of lynching up in the 20s or 30s. There's tons of violence against black people, and so if you have hundreds of years of extreme violence and extreme illiberalism, it's not unreasonable to say that a political force could walk in and just say, okay, you lost your driver's license. We just can't trust you to do this. And, maybe the people who want to revise the Voting Rights Act, they have a point that maybe it's not as bad as it used to be. And that's probably true in some level. Like, I don't think Louisiana today is the Louisiana of 1965. That's just not the case. But still, given the controversies over like voter ID laws and these kind of other issues and what happened on January 6th, I would say I would exert a lot of caution and just say, you're still on probation, Southern states. There's a lot of dodgy stuff happening there, and that was the context. And this is why I am very interested in the Voting Rights Act and making sure that people's rights to vote are still protected. Even though it doesn't strict a Madisonian line, the bigger lesson is that if one party in the interaction is a repeat offender over centuries, then you have to treat them with extreme caution in the way that, like, if I ripped you off, Bill, for, if I didn't pay you or I, trashed your lawn or destroy your garden or whatever, and I did it year after year after year, the normal liberal rights I would have in a liberal regime would be suspended, and people would say that's okay, and that's not a crazy thing.
Okay. Yeah, great. So before we wrap things up, I just wanted to ask briefly, do liberals sometimes have a bad habit of coming across as if their defense of progress over the past few centuries means they also defend everything about the status quo, including the injustices that we've discussed that are worth addressing, maybe despite this progress?
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it really depends who you talk to. When you throw the liberal tent out there, it includes a lot of different kinds of people. So, for example, a couple of years ago, there's a discussion of something called brutalist libertarianism, and that's you may remember this, Bill, where there's this idea that libertarians have to defend the most awkward, um, dodgy stuff, and maybe they do, as we talked about with like free speech rights. Like the guy next to me who believes horrible things about Black people or Jewish people is still a human being with rights, right? And you just got to deal with that. So sometimes when you do that, it comes off as if you're defending all the bad stuff as well as the good stuff. I think the much more reasonable thing that most liberals can take pride in are a couple of really simple, basic points that are just incredibly hard to argue against once you're like illiterate on the once you're literate on the topic. So, for example, one of our main things is that people should not be bullied by states. Right? They shouldn't be enslaved. They shouldn't be segregated. They shouldn't have an apartheid system. They shouldn't be punished for going to the wrong church. All this kind of stuff. They shouldn't be punished for being an immigrant. This is something we're seeing today. And, that system works pretty well, right? So societies where they kind of have that liberal idea of like a limited state that does specific things rather than does everything for people or bullies people, rolling that back seems to produce pretty good societies. Point number two, economic liberalism, right? Economic liberalism, like, does it resolve all poverty? No, but it resolves a bunch of it. And that so far, that's, a pretty good track record compared to almost everything else, right? We talked about free speech, and we can say, well, are societies where speech is highly controlled better than societies where it is highly liberal? I would say the liberal speech societies are pretty good. And, if I don't like something in America, I just turn off the TV. I block you on Twitter. And, it's really interesting that these kind of free speech anarchies that we have, like, or I'm sorry, not Twitter, X, they have liberal solutions. People can say, I'm blocking you. I'm logging off. I don't like Twitter. I'm going to Blue Sky because that's better for me. Right. So the multiplicity, the pluralism that liberals really advocate seems to work. And this is amazing because, like, if you like regular X or Twitter, you could do that. If you want to do the Trumpy nationalist alt-right version, you have a Truth. If you want to do the more progressive version with a different audience and slightly different rules, then you could do Blue Sky, right? And so, does it resolve every problem associated with free speech? No, nothing does. But just qualitatively, it seems to work. There are a few people in the West who say we should do what China does. And by the way, China is actually a true alternative that is not liberal.
Mhm.
Like the social media is literally controlled by the state. And they have rules about what you can and can't say. So what I learned from my colleagues who study China is that there's actually like even a regulated liberalism. Like if you don't like a specific policy in China, you're allowed to say it on Weibo. That's their version of X or Twitter. What you can't do is you can't organize for change. So like you could say like I don't like the tax policy in my town or my province, but you can't say we're having a protest about this tax policy or the police or something. Like they crack down on that hard. But I see very few Americans saying, okay, let's do the Weibo model. Let's just dump that. So what I would say is that liberalism is it works. It just Google it. As Kurt Signetti at IU, the football coach, I teach at IU. That's his famous phrase now. Just Google it. Just like you want freedom of speech in a society where most people are okay. Google it. It works. Economic freedom kind of works. A regime of legal rights where you have protections doesn't always work perfectly, but it kind of works a lot of the time, and it was way better. And I think maybe that's the ultimate, message that liberals, both classical liberals and maybe modern progressive liberals and other people who put themselves under the umbrella have for everybody else, which is Google it. It works. It's not a bad system. People complain about it from time to time, but when you actually investigate their complaints, they're not that bad, or they're exaggerating them. Or they're dodgy characters. Like I don't want to give Trump the power to do all elections the way he wants them to do. I'm very comfortable with Bloomington having a different system slightly than conservative towns and with different rules. That's okay. Splitting it up and letting people doing it their own way is not a crazy thing. And I live in a country that's a pretty well-adjusted country compared to most other places. So Google it. Liberalism, it works.
Yeah, and perhaps most importantly, the nod to the national championship Hoosiers. So congratulations to
Yes,
that
yeah, I'm required to say that
for the next year, right?
for the next year,
Yeah.
national champs, 16-0. So there you
Yeah.
go.
Okay. Well, any final thoughts on this chapter or announcements about your upcoming work?
Oh yeah. So maybe a couple things that people should get into. Like if you're really interested in classical liberalism from a sociological perspective, from a social science perspective, check out the book Sociology and Classical Liberalism and Dialogue. Freedom is Something We Do Together. That is open access. So go to the Bloomsbury website, Google it, and there's like a button for the open access. Definitely check out the other chapters that Michaela edited in Liberal Emancipation. There's a lot of very interesting discussions of different topics from this perspective of protecting minority rights and thinking about freedom more generally. That's great. And if also my new book on the art world and the art market is coming out later from Oxford University Press, co-written with David De La Torre. It's called Two Visions of the Art World. So if you are interested in the very complicated and messy world of the arts, check that out. And I got some more stuff coming up. And anybody who's out there may want to check out my Substack, Temple of Sociology. I'd love to interact with you and let's chat. So thank you very much, Bill.
Great. Well, thank you for your insights, Dr. Rojas, and we'll see about getting some of those links on any of the postings. So appreciate your time.
Thank you.
The Equal Freedom Institute is a grassroots think tank bringing together the next generation of liberal thought leaders, policymakers, and community organizers. If you want to see more programming like this, please make a donation at equalfreedom.org/donate. As a volunteer-led organization with no corporate or institutional backing, we urgently need your support. Liberals have a rare and real opportunity to roll back the spread of right-wing ideologies, but only if we act fast. As a 501c3 nonprofit, all donations to EFI are tax deductible. Join us at equalfreedom.org. And you can follow us on Facebook, Blue Sky, and LinkedIn.